You were lied to. Football did not start in England, and the first match had no rules. It had no referee. There were no limits, and definitely, it had no mercy. Today, you will discover where football really comes from, how it went from being a brutal and messy game to becoming the most popular sport on the planet. Misconception. When talking about the origin of football, almost everyone thinks of England. And yes, England was key, but it was not the starting point for everything. What it did was not invent it from scratch. What it did was take something much older, organize it, write rules, and transform it into what we know today. Because there is a big difference between inventing football and organizing football. Early antecedents. Long before modern football, this already existed. Different cultures were already playing with a ball, using their feet. It wasn't the same game we see today, but the idea was already there. In China, for example, there was something called kuju, a game where you had to kick a ball towards a goal. In Mesoamerica, there were ball games, although they were more ritualistic and much more intense. And in ancient Greece and Rome, there were also physical ball games, where body control was key. They weren't football, as we know it today, but they all have something in common. The idea of mastering a ball and taking it to a goal. And that changes everything, because it means that football was not born in just one place. It was born in many parts, much longer before than you imagined. The Chinese Cuju, one of the clearest examples, appears in China. More than 2,000 years ago, it was called kuju, and although it sounds distant, it was more like football than you imagine. The goal was simple: kick a ball and try to make it go through an opening. You couldn't use your hands. Everything depended on foot control, on precision, and on skill. It wasn't total chaos, like what would come later. It was a game with some organization, with basic rules, and with a clear goal. Now think about it for a second. A ball, a goal, and players using their feet. It sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? But here comes the interesting part. Although the kuju already had many football elements, the story hasn't reached its wildest part yet, because what happened next didn't look like a sport. It looked more like a battle. Medieval football. After those first games, everything changed, and it changed for the worse. In the Middle Ages, football became total chaos. There were no clear rules. There were no referees. There were no defined teams. Sometimes dozens of people played. Other times, hundreds. Yes, hundreds. Two entire villages could face each other, trying to carry a ball from one point to another. No limits, no pitch, no control. It was played in streets, in fields, or directly through the whole town. Shoving, hits, falls, anything went. The ball passed from hand to hand, or rolled through the crowd, while everyone ran without stopping. It wasn't a sport. It was disorder. It was force. It was survival. Imagine trying to play like that today. It would be impossible, but at that time, that was football. And the most incredible thing is that this is just the beginning. Why it was so violent. But this wasn't just a game, nor simple entertainment. For many people, it was something much deeper. It was a way to release tension, to download frustration, to compete, not only as individuals, but as a community. Village against village, neighborhood against neighborhood, pride against pride. It didn't just matter to win. It mattered to show who was stronger, who resisted more, who didn't give up. That's why it was so violent, because there were no clear limits, but there were very real emotions. It was a strange mix: party, rivalry, and chaos, everything at the same time. Football, at that moment, was not a sport. It was almost a social explosion, half organized, and when something moves people that much, it always ends up causing problems. Prohibitions. The problem began to be evident. These matches were not harmless. They broke windows, they damaged houses, they hurt people, and many times, they ended in real fights. The chaos did not stay in the game. It spread to the whole town. Daily life stopped, and that, not everyone liked. That's why, at different times, the authorities made a decision to ban it. Yes, ban football. Kings and rulers tried to stop it again and again, but there was a problem. People didn't want to stop playing, because this was no longer just a game. It was part of them. And when something is banned so many times, it is not because it is insignificant. It is because it is more powerful than it seems. England did not invent it. So, where does England come into all this? This is where everything changes, because England did not invent football. What it did was something different, something much more important. It took that chaos and started to organize it. In the 19th century, in English schools, students were already playing versions of this game, but there was a problem. Each place had its own rules. In some, you could use your hands. In others, You couldn't. Some were more violent, others more controlled. It was total disorder, and that made it impossible to compete. Then a need appeared to unify rules, to set limits, to define what can be done and what cannot. And that is where the real change began. The game stopped being unpredictable and started to become something organized, something repeatable, something that could grow. England did not create football, but it transformed it. Lo converso and un sistema. And that system is what ended up conquering the world. Rules are born. When common rules appeared, everything changed. The game stopped being a chaos. It was no longer just about pushing a ball in an uncontrolled crowd. Now there were clear limits. There was a defined field. There were concrete goals. And for the first time, there was order. Violence was reduced. Movements were controlled. And the game started to depend less on strength and more on skill, on strategy, on precision. The players were no longer a mess. They were teams, with positions, with roles, with intention. And that changed everything. Because now, one could truly compete. The game could be repeated. It could be improved. And most importantly, it could be understood. Football stopped being unpredictable, and it started to become a sport. Separation from rugby. But in the middle of that organization, a key problem appeared. What could be done with the hands? Because until that moment, it was not entirely clear. Some games allowed grabbing the ball, others prohibited it. And that difference ended up changing everything. Because not everyone wanted to play the same way. Some preferred a more physical game, more direct. Others wanted something more technical, more precise. Then, the path split. On one side, rugby was born, a game where hands were a fundamental part. And on the other, football was consolidated, a game where the foot was the protagonist. Two different sports, same origin, but completely different rules. And that decision defined the game we know today. Global expansion. Once football had clear rules, something inevitable happened. The game began to travel. It was no longer something chaotic and local. Now it was understandable, replicable, and that made it perfect to expand. From England, football began to cross borders. Through ships, merchants, workers, it reached distant ports, new cities, other continents, and in every place, someone learned it and played it again. Thus, the first clubs were born, the first competitions, and little by little, football ceased to be English. It became global, a language that needs no translation, where all you need is a ball and the desire to play. And so, a game that started as chaos ended up becoming the most popular sport on the planet. So, who invented football? The answer is not so simple. It wasn't a single country. It wasn't a single person. Football wasn't born all at once. It was an evolution, a chain of ideas, games, cultures that were transformed over time, from Kuju in China, passing through ancient games, to the brutal chaos of the Middle Ages, and finally, the organization in England. Yes, England was fundamental, but it wasn't the absolute origin. Fue el punto de orden, the moment when all that chaos became something understandable, into something that could grow. And that is what makes football so special, that it doesn't belong to a single place. It belongs to history, to the people, to everyone. So no, football didn't start the way you were told. And maybe that's why it remains so powerful, because it mixes chaos, passion, history, and rules into one single game. A game that has been evolving for centuries, and that still today continues to unite us. If you liked this video, subscribe, because here we don't tell you the story like always. We show it to you for real.